just a little thought on things. In the 1970s, there was a big boom in something known as the soap opera. Okay, and it existed well before the 70s, but 70s was the big boom. There were lots of them that just kept creeping up. And I'll be honest with you, during the 80s, I watched some of them myself. Okay, as weird as I know, that's like my closet sin there. Okay, and so I remember all the time to how embarrassing it used to be to watch soap operas. I knew there was a problem when my mom would be reading the soap opera digest at Meijer, and then the pastor of the church we were attending came by, and he said, "Hi there." She went, "Oh," and just kind of, I don't know what I'm reading. How you doing, Pastor? And so I was like, oh, so soap operas are a bad thing. And then as time grew on and I grew up, I realized, yeah, they just are terrible things. But they're fun. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed Days of Our Lives. That was my little thing. I had a free hour after lunch in high school, so I would ride my bike from school. We had an open campus every day during my lunch and free hour. I scheduled my free hour on purpose to be 1 o'clock, so I could catch Days at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, so that was me throughout my teen years, enjoying Steve Johnson and Roman Brady, and I still remember. It's just so sad. But nonetheless, okay, so soap operas. And you can always tell a soap opera. You can tell by the way they're lit. You can tell by the way they act. You can tell by the stories. And the crazy stories they would have. So-and-so's related to so-and-so, and so-and-so met so-and-so, and suddenly their head's going to pop open and an alien comes out. No, that'd be cool. They're just really weird stories, okay? And then they always had these musical accents, right? Right? They would have a musical accent that would happen whenever somebody revealed a deep truth or revealed a family relation. You get like a like what we heard, or a thunk thunk, or whatever. You'd always get some type of an accent that would say, but here's the thing. I'm looking at Acts here, and I'm looking through it, and what we're going to deal with is the Apostle Paul and a whole company went out on a mission trip, and they're planting churches. They're doing a lot, dealing with circumcision conflict within the churches there, having a problem. And what's going to take place is Paul and Barnabas are going to get in a fight, and they're going to part ways. The fight's going to appear to be over John Mark, and then Paul's going to take Silas, and they're going to go off on one way, and Mark and Barnabas are going to go off on another way, and then Mark's going to meet up with Peter, and then he's going to go back to Paul again, and it's going to be a stinking soap opera, okay? In fact, if I were to make Acts into a soap opera, if I were to make my own soap opera about the book of Acts, I think I would call it Saints and Sinners. And maybe it would have a great little opening with a cloudy background, and the lights would begin to come up on the stage as the actors filled the screen, looking so pretty. And we would be able to learn about the lives that is the saints and the sinners, and how like sands through an hourglass. So go the days of ministry. Okay, so that's what I would do. And so we're going to have a little soap operatic approach here. So occasionally we're going to run across a twist, a little revelation, a little moment of informational detail that's going to pop up, and we're going to have a musical accent. And we're going to have some fun with this, all right? You ready for some fun with this? Let's engage with the book of Acts here. So what we're going to look at first is just it's kind of like last week on Saints and Sinners. We're going to kind of do a little recap. And this is that there was a big battle about circumcision. And circumcision is not usually a topic that you want to preach about on a Sunday morning. Most people don't wake up at 6 a.m. going, oh, I hope the pastor preaches on circumcision. That's not usually where our minds go, and so you're welcome. We are. And we did last week, and we will again. It's an issue that's a cut above the rest. And no matter how you slice it, that's funny. I know, puns are divisive, right? And so, anyway, I know. I'm like really on the edge of a knife now. Anyway. We'll just cut it out, and we will move on with a whole new issue here. So there was this issue of circumcision in the church. What was happening was when the church started, it was Jewish. There was a lot of Jews in it. That's all they were. It were predominantly Jews, and eventually their mission outreached out to the Gentiles. So the Gentiles were being brought into the church, but now there's an issue. The Jewish people were always under the old Abrahamic covenant of circumcision. Circumcision was like a wedding ring. It let you know that you were the people of God, though I don't know how you would show that to people appropriately. So nonetheless, it was this interesting sign of that relationship between the people and God and the people. And we talked about the details of that last week. If you want the details, go to that sermon. Note and point, that sermon refers you back to Genesis sermon. And so you're going to have to do some YouTube viewing. But nonetheless, there was a fight that happened. The Jews said the Gentiles had to be circumcised, and the Gentiles said, no, which I understand that point of view. Okay, I would not, if someone told me, hey, would you like to join our church? Sure. All you have to do is, drop your drawers and take out a knife. Yeah, I think I'll go find a different church. That's just where I would be. In all honesty, I would find a different church. And so they're like, this is the issue. You need to be circumcised. And they're like, no. They're like, well, if you're not circumcised, then you're not even the people of God. And the Gentiles started saying, no, you don't understand. Salvation is Jesus only, not Jesus and something else. And the Jews said, no, it's Jesus and circumcision. The Gentiles like, no, it's Jesus only. Jesus and circumcision. Jesus only. And there was a stalemate on that. And so they brought in Paul and Barnabas and some of the leaders, and they started arguing and debating. They couldn't get to an answer. So they sent them to Jerusalem, the mother church. And they get to Jerusalem. They said, is it Jesus only or Jesus and circumcision? And the Jerusalem church said, they started fighting. It's Jesus and circumcision. Jesus only. Jesus and circumcision. Jesus only. So all the elders got together in one big church council, and they hammered it out, and they said, it's Jesus only, not Jesus and. If the Jews want to be circumcised, knock yourselves out. Don't require it of the Gentiles. And so that's where we left off last week. Now we get the conclusion of the circumcision controversy. Alliteration. Isn't it wonderful? And it starts in Acts chapter 15, starting at verse 30, and it reads as this: Then, being sent off, they went down to Antioch. This is sent off from the mother church in Jerusalem with the letter saying it's Jesus only. Okay, so that's where they're being sent off to. So Paul and company are sent off, went down to Antioch, and after gathering the assembly, they delivered the letter. When the people read it, they rejoiced. You think? No knife necessary. No more Mr. Knife Guy. Okay, so they were rejoiced because of its encouragement. Both Judas and Silas, who were also prophets themselves, interesting note, we got two great, amazing men of God here, encouraged the brothers and strengthened them with a long message. Given this is written by Luke, and Luke hung around Paul, and Paul preached for hours at a time. If Luke calls it long, it was long. Okay, you think I'm going to be long today? Oh my goodness. Okay, no complaining. Okay, after a long message, after spending some time there, you think Luke's making a point. Spending some time there, they were sent back in peace by the brothers to those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas, along with many others, remained in Antioch, teaching and proclaiming the message of the Lord. So the company gets sent back. They said, hey, circumcision is not required. Everybody rejoiced. They preached a really long sermon, spent some time together. We don't know how long. Could be weeks, could be months, could be years. We really don't know. Luke is very vague on that. They just spent some time together, and then some of them went back home. Other of them stayed to continue teaching and helping people mature in Christ. Cool. So that's the conclusion of that. Here's what gets interesting now. Is that there's another fight that breaks up. Just when you thought that one fight was over, another fight sprouts up. Isn't that just like life? Yeah. Where you get one big conflict with someone, and as soon as that's gone, and you think, now we'll have peace. Oh, no. It's not going to happen. Another conflict's going to yet arise, and that's exactly what takes place. So it continues on, verse 36. After some time had passed, thank you again, Luke. How much time? Weeks, months, years? I don't know. Okay, so after some time had passed, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit the brothers in every town where we had preached the message of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take along John Mark. Continues. But Paul did not think it appropriate to take along this man, not John Mark. Okay, Paul's like, this guy over here, a little harsh impersonal term there maybe, did not want to take along this man who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone on with them to the work. There was such a sharp disagreement that they parted company, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed off to Cyprus. Then Paul chose Silas and departed after being commended to the grace of the Lord by the brothers. He traveled through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So here's what kind of begins happening here, is that Paul gets the idea, let's gather up the band and all the instruments. Let's go on a reunion tour. You know, if Kiss can do it, then we can do it too. So they want to go on a reunion tour. Barnabas goes, but we need an opening act. We need Mark. Let's bring John Mark with us. And Paul's like, no, we performed with him earlier, and he left the stage. He left us performing alone. We don't want to have that guy opening up for us again. What if he leaves again? And they fight and they argue so much that they split. The band splits like Wham. Okay, so the band splits, but differently. They go on to 2 different concert tours. It'd be kind of like DC went one way and Talk went the other. And that's, you know, and I understand that Newsboys and Toby Mac are awesome, but doggone it, I miss DC Talk. You know, so that's a band that split, for those that don't know. And so this is what happens. So they split, and they go on to their own ways at that point. Now, we're going to talk more about this in great detail, but I want to finish the story first, because something else happens, something very weird. Okay, first, the original fight was on what issue? Jesus and what issue? Circumcision. Good. Some people were paying attention. It's good to know. Some people just don't want to say it. That C word. You know? And so the issue is circumcision. But now, when Paul and Silas go on their first missionary trip together, Paul's second missionary trip, but with Silas, their first together, and they're going off, they're going to run across a guy named Timothy. Okay, they're going to run across a guy named Timothy, and here's what Paul's going to do. He's going to say, hey, Timothy, would you like to join the band? And Timothy's going to be like, yeah, I would love to join the band. I'm great on bass. And Paul's going to be like, great, cool, join the band. One requirement, though, you must be circumcised. And this is weird, because Paul just spent so much time saying circumcision is not necessary. Circumcision is not necessary. In fact, one of the letters Paul wrote to Galatia, know what he said about circumcision? He said, you idiots. Seriously, it's in the Greek. Okay, we usually translate it differently, but it means idiot. He's like, you idiots. Circumcision does not make you more holy. Then he said, I'll tell you what, if you think cutting off a little bit makes you more holy, then get really holy and do it all the way. That's what he tells them. I'm not making that up. Okay, so Paul was really like anti-circumcision in a sense. Okay, he really was. He's like, if Jews want to do it, cool. But he was like, it's not important. It doesn't make you holy. Then he gets Timothy, and he tells Timothy, you must be circumcised. What? Are you confused? I'm confused. I read that and I went, what? Okay, seriously, it was high pitched like that. It was into my falsetto. What? Okay, and so that it's weird. So let's see what happens here. This goes into chapter 16, just when you thought, well, it's the end of 15. Why doesn't the sermon stop at the chapters we added? They're not in the original. I go by where the story and the grammar stops. For us, that's chapter 16, verse 5. Okay, so check this out. 16:1, moving on. Then Saul, went to Derbe and Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy. Remember, I told you all about this. It shouldn't be a surprise now. Disciple named Timothy, the son of a believing Jewish woman. So she's a Jewish Christian. So keep that in mind. But his father was a Greek. A believing Greek? Doesn't say that. So he's a non-Christian, okay? So Timothy's mother, Christian, Jew, father, non-Christian, Greek. That's the situation there. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke highly of him, of Timothy. So Paul wanted Timothy to go with him, so he took him and circumcised him. Isn't that great? Paul did it himself, no doctor involved. Now, Luke traveled with Paul, so it's possible that Luke might have done it, and he just didn't want to record it because, well, why would you want to go into that type of detail? But nonetheless, okay, and circumcise him because of the Jews who were in those places, since they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they traveled through the towns, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem for them to observe. So this is ironic. They're going around telling everyone circumcision is not required. That's their message. Sound like hypocrisy? No, not really. We're going to see in just a moment. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. Okay, so this is really, really, really weird. Okay, this is really weird. Scholars have a lot of fun writing a lot of literature about this, trying to explain one way or another. Rather than bore you with the hours of research involved in this, I'll just give you the highlights. Sound like fun? Or would you rather be here for another hour and we'll just go through the whole... Okay, the highlights are fine. That's all right. If you want the more stuff on it, you're more than welcome to see me, and I will refer you to the about that high stack of books for you. Here's what's going on with this. Why did Paul do this? That's been kind of one of the key questions. And the answer is because of, what does the text say? The Jews. Okay, because of the Jews, which is interesting. It's not that circumcision was required for salvation. It was not required for salvation. Paul makes that very clear. The apostolic decreed letter makes that very clear. Circumcision is not required for salvation, but circumcision is necessary in some instances based upon the job you are doing. For example, Timothy and Paul were about to minister to Jews. Would Jews view the message from an uncircumcised Jew as appropriate? No, they would not. Okay, so there are times and situations in life where one might have to kind of go through giving up certain rights, certain privileges, if it means removing a barrier between you, the gospel, and the person you're ministering to. Okay, there are sometimes barriers that are there. Is it on a lighter scale, circumcision is really serious and severe, but it's a serious and severe mission. And I think Timothy knew he was called to that job. And when told, hey, this is what you're going to need to do this job, Timothy didn't go home. Notice that. Timothy went, if that's what's required, then I'm on board. Okay, so that's amazing of Timothy, because I would have gone home. Okay, in all honesty, if that was in Timothy's shoes, I would go home. I'd be like, yeah, God's calling me someplace else. He must be. And if God would have to light a bush on fire to say, go back and get that knife. Are you serious, God? Oh, come on. I would have a big Moses battle with God. Just being honest. I'm weak that way. I know that about myself. Timothy, I respect this young guy. Okay, because that is gutsy. But here's the thing. On a lighter way, sometimes we have to give up things if it means the gospel not being obstructed. For example, if for me, one of the things I gave up is I don't drink alcohol at all. Now, drunkenness is a sin. Absolutely is a sin. But drinking alcohol is not. There's nowhere in the Bible calls it a sin. It calls it, be wary of it. It's like a snake, and if you're not careful, it'll bite you. So be very careful, but it's not a sin. Now, I choose complete abstinence on it. I don't even cook with it if I can avoid it, because I don't want alcohol in my house. That's just kind of how I roll with that, because I have run across many times in my ministry alcoholics. And the last thing I want to do is invite an alcoholic over to my house and have them see something that I would have every right to have, but then let it be a stumbling block for them. I don't want it to be a stumbling block, so I have chosen out of my own personal conviction and sense of calling of ministry to remove that area from me. Okay, so I have, in a sense, if you will, circumcised my alcohol, if you will. I have cut it away. And then we all are going to have to make choices like that from time to time. In fact, that's actually a really good question we could all eventually at one point ask ourselves. What obstacles are existing between you and the gospel, and or between you, the gospel, and somebody else? What is preventing you from either accepting the gospel that you need to cut out of your life, or what is preventing you from properly sharing the gospel and you need to cut something out of your life so that obstacle's not there? Okay, so that's one of the questions to begin to try to ask ourselves, is that issue. So why did Paul do this? So that there be no barrier between Paul, Timothy, the gospel, and the Jews that they're about to meet up with. Now, having said that, let's get to the juicy stuff. I know, circumcision was already fun, but let's talk about this Paul rejecting Mark issue, because this is important stuff. And there has been more written on this than circumcision. I kid you not. Okay, this is interesting. Why did Paul reject Mark? Why did he tell Mark to absolutely go away and that he can't come along with them on their journey? It's kind of this, you can't play in our sandbox type issue. And people come along different sides of the issue on this, and here's how some of the views go. Most actually, commentaries that I have read said that Paul was in the wrong here, that Paul was lacking mercy, should have forgiven John Mark's failures in the past, trusted that he would do better in the future. Okay, that's how most people treat it. Bad Paul, this is really sad that this division occurred, and Paul is kind of in the wrong. Now, I'm actually going to come alongside and agree with Paul. I'm going to go against a lot of the commentaries and kind of agree with Paul's point of view. I'm going to also agree that it was sad that they split. I'm going to put the blame more on Barnabas than Paul. And that's going to be really contrary to the way a lot of churches go. And so if you choose to disagree with me on this, that's fine. We can split our ways. No, I disagree with the splitting. I don't think the splitting should have happened. But I agree with Paul's point of view that Mark shouldn't come along. Because here's the thing. Do people deserve a second chance? Yes. Absolutely. I am the first to know and to admit that I've been given multiple chances. I have failed countless times. Give me an hour, I'll fail again. Okay, I absolutely need multiple chances, and I've been given multiple chances. Do I believe Mark should have been given multiple chances? Absolutely believe he should have been, and I agree with Paul. Confused? Okay, good. Some people are nodding. Some people are like, I don't care. I got up for this. Okay, but for those that nodded, let me share with you why this works together. Because I believe, yes, people deserve second chances. And I also believe that it is appropriate to be able to tell someone, no, you cannot return to this particular area of service at this time. You need to first grow, mature, and develop. And after you have maintained that maturity for a while, then we can return you back to the position of service you were once at. And so you see where that says, no, you can't come with us now, but you can join us later, after you've worked through the issues, after there's been some maturity, after there's been some growth and some development that has happened. Because here's the thing, think of it, this is, I think, the approach Paul was going at it. Because after all, it even says in the text, I like going with what the text says, it says that Paul didn't want to take Mark because Mark deserted, left, abandoned, okay? That Mark left, okay? That was equal to a person who's a soldier in the army in the middle of a battlefield, just getting up, packing up his stuff, and going home. Okay, that is punishable by so many things, even up to the point of people calling you a traitor. Okay, so you just don't abandon your post like that. I mean, you get fired from your jobs, don't you? If you just decide to, I'm just going to go home. You know, I'm working, I think I'm going to go home. Just pack up your stuff and leave. And let everybody else carry the weight. You think your boss will be happy? You think you'll be first on line for the promotion? You know, it doesn't work like that. And so same thing with John Mark here, okay? So I believe that's Paul's attitude. It was about the desertion issue. And so Paul, he doesn't want a distraction between him and the gospel. He doesn't want circumcision required of the Gentiles. He doesn't want Timothy's lack of circumcision to distract the gospel to the Jews. And he definitely doesn't want a deserter. Because you know what happens when somebody gets up and leaves in the middle of a mission trip? What does that do to the morale of the rest of the team? What does that do to the motivation? What does that do to your momentum? What does that do to your emotional whatever? You see, it really dampens the whole thing. And so Paul does not want that distraction there at all. But then that leaves a different question. Why does Barnabas want Mark then? Why does Barnabas not want Mark? Because Paul's like, he deserted us last time. Let's make sure he's going to stick around before we bring him on again. And Barnabas is like, bring him, come on. You know, and they're just going, so why does Barnabas want to defend Mark so much that he's going to the mattresses for him? And so here's what some people say. Some people say, well, you see, Barnabas, he sees the good in people. And that's true. Barnabas does see the good in people. After all, Barnabas defended Saul before he was known as an apostle. He was the Boba Fett of the New Testament, killing Christians. Okay, so Christians didn't trust Saul at all, also called Paul. And Barnabas went to the mattresses for him, defending him. He saw the good in Saul and Paul / okay, he saw the good in him and wanted to, so maybe he saw the good in Barnabas. But here's the thing. Yes, Barnabas sees the good in people, but Paul was not a deserter. Okay, so Paul was always a loyal guy of integrity and was always a great guy of follow-through. Even when he was wrong, he had great follow-through. Okay, and so Paul wasn't a deserter, so it seems a little bit different situations going on here. Some people say, well, you see, Barnabas, he's his namesake. His name means encouragement, one who encourages, and he's the encourager. So therefore, Barnabas encouraged Mark to grow past his failures and to be a great man. And while that is absolutely true, Barnabas is an encourager and definitely was likely encouraging Mark. I believe that is definitely a possibility there. You can definitely encourage someone without including them on every excursion and putting them back into a position of leadership. There's other types of encouragement that's there. It doesn't require that. So maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something that goes beyond all of this. Could it be that Mark is Barnabas's cousin? And that's exactly the case. This is what we find. Mark is family. Check it out, Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Paul's writing to Colossus, and he says this. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, as does Mark, Barnabas's cousin. Okay, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. So Paul viewed very highly of Mark to say when Mark comes to you, treat him well. And oh, by the way, he's Barnabas' cousin. Okay, so here's what's going on. Why is Barnabas going to the mattresses for Mark? Family blood ties, okay? They're family. That's what's going on. All right? And of course, do you think that family impacts your decisions you make? Oh, I think so. I think family impacts our decisions a lot. Okay, so this is what's going on. So I believe it's all three. I believe that Barnabas definitely saw the good in Mark, saw the potential in Mark. I believe Barnabas wanted to encourage Mark, and he's family. And you go to town for family, because friends are fickle, but family's forever. Isn't that kind of how the alliteration goes? Right? And so it's all about that. So I believe that's definitely part of the issue that's here. Now, why doesn't Luke say that? Luke, the historian. Luke, the educated doctor. Luke, who writes in classical Greek rather than Koine Greek and makes everything all complicated. Luke, the one who is researching details so that the great mighty Theophilus will understand the propers of the attitudes and the doctrines of the faith. Why doesn't Luke mention it? Because it's more interesting to leave it out. I kid you not. That's why. It was the Greek attitude of writing that you leave out family relations so that the tension seems greater to the reader. Because once you throw in the family, everyone goes, oh, well, I see what the problem is now. Barnabas is just going after Mark because he's family. And Paul's not falling for it. Oh, that makes sense. But without that, there's tension, right? It's more interesting. And that's how the Greek wrote. They made it more interesting. And plus, it's a soap opera. You got to wait till later to get that musical accent. In this case, Colosh. So now we have some plot thickening. We got some family ties that are going on. So I would actually, because of family ties, I think I would cast a part of Mark by Michael J. Fox. Family ties. Come on. That's not. Am I the only one that lived in the 80s? I mean, come on. I'm like one of the younger ones here. I know you were around in the 80s. Who were around when Kennedy was alive. Some of you were around when Moses was still walking around. So now this brings about another question then. Why does Paul and Barnabas part ways? Sure, it's one thing to say no Mark, no Mark, no Mark, and then the other one says yes, Mark, no Mark, Mark. Sounds like a dog with a hair lip. Mark. Okay, and so they're just going back. No Mark. But why the separation here? Why can't Paul it seems like a really trivial issue, doesn't it? If I were Paul, I'd pull an Arnold Schwarzenegger from the movie Predator. I'd be like, he's your baggage. If you get slow, you fall behind. That's how I would do it. I would do it like that. He's your baggage. I would pull a Schwarzenegger. That's how I would do it. But Paul doesn't do that. He holds his ground. And he says, no, he is not coming. No, no, no. And so then comes the question, why? Why such contention? Some scholars have said that, Barnabas is supposed to stay behind and mentor Timothy. Well, that's what happens, but that's not the motivation. That's not the motivation isn't Barnabas, you stay. The motivation was, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go. Okay, so originally there was a type of uniting that was happening there that became a division. So that's interesting. And then a second point of view says that, well, you see, this is because this is the starting of sending out missionaries 2 by 2. And this is where this all came from. They came out in 2 different missionary journeys, and they decided you can cover more ground as 2 separate teams. Jesus sent people out 2 by 2 well before Paul ever did. And so that doesn't the motivation of that at all. And then secondly, Acts is descriptive, not prescriptive. This is not the verse to say this is why we send out missionaries 2 by 2. Okay, this is not the verse for that. Because Paul traveled with Silas and others. Okay, there was a crowd that went. It wasn't just 2 worth naming. Okay, and so that doesn't fit well. Could it be that there's another reason? Could it be that there actually was animosity between Paul and Barnabas? Could it be Paul really said, okay, Barnabas, we planted this together, we started this together, let's finish this together, but really was glad to find an excuse to send Barnabas away? Could it be that there was contention between them two, that Paul and Barnabas weren't seeing eye to eye? Could it be because that Barnabas believed circumcision equaled salvation? Could that be what's going on? That Barnabas believed a heresy? That is Jesus and circumcision? Could Barnabas really believe that? Well, I would like to encourage you to turn to the book of Galatians, chapter 2, verse 13. And it says there that then, this is after the council that they were just at. Okay, so they're at the council, and the rest of the Jews joined this hypocrisy of circumcision equaling salvation. So that even Barnabas was what? Carried away by their hypocrisy. Barnabas was convinced that it's Jesus and circumcision, not just Jesus. So Barnabas got carried away in it. Barnabas believed the wrong doctrine. You think that offended Paul? Yes, it offended Paul. Absolutely. So, think of it like this. When did Barnabas get carried away? Was it something new, or did it happen all the way back at the council? It happened at the council itself. Yes. Okay, so this has been going on for a while now. So all the way back when they were trying to deal with Jerusalem and deal with all the conflict, it was not just Paul versus the legalistic people of the churches. It's Paul versus legalistic of the churches and Barnabas, his own partner in crime, all along the way. So this is becoming a real interesting little, you see where this gets complicated? This gets real complicated because it's not so simple as, oh, you want Mark? Then fine, go have Mark. I have nothing to do with you. It's not so simple as that. There are issues that are going on that cut right to the core of the issue. I'm allowed a pun. Come on. That's all right. Okay, and so that's what's going on here. This is just, and so here's the thing. Does conflict impact our decisions? I think so. I think our past conflicts do impact current decisions. Sometimes that's wise. Sometimes it's wise depending on the conflict. Sometimes, but here's the thing. Yes, it's wise to say, hey, we had this conflict. Do you believe this issue? This is a problem. But how long do we let that fester? How long do we let that conflict be an influential part of our decision making? And when do we no longer hold that conflict against a person? And let me just be honest with you, there's no rule here for that. There's no rule that I could say, this is how long, this long and no more. Do you want to know how long it was for John Mark? 10 years. Okay, it's about 10 years between the time that Mark deserted them and then we see Mark and Paul traveling together. About a decade. Now, I'm not going to say let's hold grudges for a decade. We shouldn't hold grudges at all. But there are times where we need to be wise about our decision-making regarding past conflicts, for example, and past situations. I'm all for forgiveness. I'm not for grudges at all. I think we should always forgive. I think there should be no grudges. Anyone that holds a grudge does not support the love of Christ in a proper way. That's what John says in 1 John. If you hold a grudge, the love of God is not in you, period. It's very direct on that. So I think grudges does not belong in the church. I do believe in forgiveness with consequences. I do believe in forgiveness with consequences. For example, if somebody were to come in and they'd want to join the church, but they're a sex offender. They've been convicted of being a sex offender, and they've been released out of jail, and now they're trying to reincorporate themselves into the community. Can they join the church? If they love Jesus and are repentant and follower of Jesus Christ, absolutely they can join the church. They cannot work with our kids. Okay, they will never work with our kids. And I've had some people push back on that sometimes. In the classes that I teach at like Cornerstone and at Grace College, they'll be like, well, what if they're not even, what if it's not a child-related crime? What if it's not, I just go, I don't care. It's not about that. If they're a sex offender, they're not working with our kids, plain and simple. They said, well, shouldn't there be forgiveness? Oh, yeah, there is. They can join the church. They can serve in a dozen different ways. We got lots of things they could do within our congregation. There's lots of things they can do, but our kids is not going to be one of them. There's going to be limits to that. Okay, and if somebody were to work their way into leadership in a church, and let's say they leave the church and they join another church, and then they decide to come back, are they going to start right back where they left off? No. We're going to wait a while before they get put right back into the leadership position again. We're going to wait a while, make sure they're going to stick it out for a while, and that we're just not the backup plan until something better comes along. You know, some of you people have dated people like that. Okay, isn't that a great love song? You're everything I always wanted. Well, not really, but you're good enough for now. It's a real song, by the way, Weird Al Yankovic. Don't want him suing me. Leave it to him. But you see, that's kind of the situation. We want to know that this is the calling. And so there's forgiveness, by all means. Come back and worship with us, by all means. But there are consequences. You know, you can definitely come back, but it's not going to be the same. It just isn't. There's been hurt, there's been betrayal, there's been brokenness, there's been wrongdoings, and things are just not going to be the same. There can definitely be forgiveness, but that doesn't mean that everything's going to be as if it never happened. Okay, so I believe in forgiveness with consequences, not forgiveness with no consequences. Okay, and that's not holding a grudge, it's just being wise. And each situation's different. In some situations, absolutely. You can just say, okay, we're just going to let it go and not ever bring it. We're never going to make that an issue. It's completely. Sometimes we can do that. Sometimes very much we should not. And there's not a place you can just draw a line on that. Sometimes we have to deal each situation individually on that with great wisdom and care. Great wisdom and care. So what happens with all of this? So Paul and Barnabas part ways. They split off. There's now Barnabas and Mark and Paul and Silas, and they're going to go, and God does great things with them, both. It's awesome. But what happens? How does this story end? You know, what ends up taking place here, and where does this go? Here's what I can tell you from looking over all that I can of both our Bible as well as any historical data that I have access to on any type of basis. Here's what I'm able to conclude at this point in time. Nowhere do I find Paul and Barnabas reconciling. I do find a couple times Paul mentioning Barnabas' name, and he doesn't do it with that dirty, rotten little, okay? He does it nicely. So it's likely that Paul doesn't have any, at least at that point of writing, any hard feelings toward Barnabas, but I don't see them really having a lot together. Paul refers to Barnabas, and for example, 1 Corinthians 9:5, where Paul mentions Barnabas as not taking money for some of his missionary trips, just like Paul doesn't take money for some of his missionary trips. So he says, Barnabas and I, we don't do this. And so it's a kind of a positive comparison that's there. So we don't have a lot about Paul and Barnabas. They just really are not a picture anymore from this point forward. And that part is a little bit sad. It's like a chapter of a page has turned, and it's just not going to get revisited. And that happens in life, doesn't it? Where you look back and you realize that, oh, that was a good year. We did a lot of stuff, but that is a chapter that has turned. For good or for bad, right or wrong, it is a chapter that is now turned. That page is flipped, and now I'm going in a different direction in this new chapter, and it's not going to be like it was. Doesn't mean it's going to be bad. It's not mean it's going to be better. It's just not going to be like it was. Okay, and we have to appreciate that. There used to be a time, I remember my daughter and my son both had the stage in their life where eating cookies and making a mess and putting food all over their faces was cute. Like my son still does this. We feed him spaghetti. We give him a fork. Does he use it to eat spaghetti? No. He puts it down. He takes his hands, and he starts feeding himself. And then when he's realized he doesn't have anything, he goes, wow, my hands are dirty. What's my American napkin? Do you think it's his pants? Like most of us would do. I've seen you in restaurants. Does he do this? No. Does he do this? No. His hair. His face is his napkin. And I go, George, what are you doing? My wife goes, stop, it's cute. It's not cute when I do it, though. That's a page of my life that has turned. And I can't go back. Not that that's good or bad, but it's normal. Okay? It's a page that has turned. And that's what it is with Paul and Barnabas. It is a page that has turned. Okay? So we can just let that go and be all right with that. Now, Mark we know a lot more about. Paul was joined by Mark in ministry at some point, about 10 years later. When Paul started writing Colossians, when he started writing Philemon, when he starts writing, you notice that in that Colossians verse it said, hey, Mark is with me. So Paul is already writing, and Mark's already with him at some point. So at some point, Paul has said, Mark, welcome back. And that is awesome. That is awesome. We have Philemon verse 24, Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. There's also an interesting passage, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. Our associate pastor's happy. Oh, you better mention that. He's always verse checking me. And he comes up to me and says, you didn't mention this. I'm like, yeah, it's because I forgot. I'll mention it next week, though. And so 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, Paul it's like Paul's last letter that he writes before he dies. Okay, so Paul's getting ready to be killed for his faith. He's in prison. He's writing out a letter. And one of his last words he writes toward the end of the letter, his last gasp, he says, send Mark to me because he's useful for ministry. So at some point, Mark left Paul to travel, I believe with Peter, because Mark traveled with Peter for a while. So at some point when Paul was unless of course, 2 Timothy is not Paul's last letter, then maybe it was before the others, who knows. But I believe that it's Paul's last letter, and that Mark at one point, whether with Peter or someone else, left for a while. And then Paul's like, you know what, I'm about to die, send him back. Send Mark back, he's useful to me. Okay, how much of a change has there been there of forgiveness of Paul and Mark? Okay, that's amazing to say he can't travel with me, to send him, he's useful. Okay, and it's not that Paul did not hold a grudge. I believe Paul saw that Mark matured, that Mark grew up, that Mark developed to become the child of God he was supposed to be. And Paul then said, come to me, work with me, I want to send you out. Okay, so it's neat to see that they work together. And apparently, Mark developed a lot because he died for the faith. One historical account indicated that Mark traveled to Alexandria, returned back to Alexandria to a previous church plant that had happened there, and Mark started preaching to the Alexandrians about Jesus. And the Alexandrians believed in false gods. A lot of the non-Christians, believed in false gods, and they got sick of Mark's preaching, and they told him to shut up. And he said, "Shut up about what?" And they're like, "Shut up! Don't talk about Jesus. Don't talk about Jesus, the one who died on the cross and rose again. Yeah, don't talk about him. Don't talk about the Son of God who came down and walked among men." They're like, "Shut up! About God, about Jesus, about the salvation, about the rest." And they took a rope, wrapped it around his neck, tied it to the back end of a horse, and drug him around the city until he died. And all the while he's being drugged, he is preaching. Okay, so what type of person? See, Mark deserted, as we had discovered before, likely out of fear. You think Mark overcame his fear issues? Yes. Okay, so Mark's story ends well. It starts all right. It gets a little rocky in the middle, but it ends well. It ends very well. Okay, now, no, and death is not a great ending. but death in the face of your faith is. And holding your faith and maintaining it to the end, that's amazing. So Mark became a guy that I believe we can all look up to with respect and say, man, I hope I had the courage of Mark. Isn't that ironic? That we could try to want to have the courage of Mark. So what can we do with this? At what point do we say, hey, we've already had lots of discussion on what we can take home, life application, but there's one other little thing I want you to take home with you. One other little observation, then we'll be done. Check this out. The churches were fighting about what issue? Circumcision. More people are comfortable with it now. That's good. Okay. People were fighting about circumcision. When they got the answer solved, did the church split into multiple churches? Or did the people celebrate together? They celebrated together. Isn't that interesting? They didn't let that division divide them. They didn't let the fight separate them. They all rejoiced together. When Mark had deserted Paul and Barnabas, you know what happened with Mark? He was not abandoned. Just because he couldn't go with Paul on this next missionary trip does not mean he was being abandoned. Because what did end up happening with Mark? He was mentored by Barnabas. He could have been mentored by somebody else. Could have been mentored by Silas. He was a godly man. Could have been mentored by Judas, not Iscariot. He died. Different Judas. I'd change my name if I were Judas. I just would. Okay, but there was a godly Judas that was there. They were called prophets. That means teachers. They were teachers of the Lord, godly men that could have mentored Mark. So either way, whether Barnabas and Paul split or not, Mark is going to be mentored. He is not going to be abandoned. And Mark wasn't abandoned. And eventually even what happens with Paul and Mark? They come together and they're able to work together. Now check this out. Parents. Anybody here a parent? Parents. Your kids are not perfect kids. Just laying that out, okay? Your kids are not perfect kids. When they were children, they did not sit at home playing with educational toys, asking you what more chores they could do. Okay, that's not how the children were, and that's not how mine are. My kids are not perfect kids either. Okay, I love my children. I will do anything for my children. I will not call them perfect. Okay, they are not. Some of them more pain in the butt than others, but that's all right. Okay, so because kids are not perfect. They don't ask to do more chores. They don't ask, how can I respect you today, Daddy? Okay, that's not what they do. They are loud. They're mouthy. They lie. They don't know how to share. They fight. Okay, and then we, as parents, get frustrated. Right? We get frustrated and we get sick and tired sometimes of the screaming, of the crying, of the disciplining, of the training, of the teaching, of the correcting, of the cleaning, we get sick and we get tired of it all. But here's the thing that we can get from all of this. If we do not do our part, our kids may not make it. Because God has a plan for their lives. God has a plan for every single child's life, and if we do not do our part, they may not make it. God has a plan for our neighbors' lives, our siblings' lives, our parents' lives. God has a plan for all of their lives, and if we do not do our part, they may not make it. We have people in our lives that may not know the gospel. They may not be Christians. They may not have accepted Jesus as their Savior. If we don't do our part, they may not get to that point. We have people that need to have somebody that can be there for them, to correct them, to rebuke them, to encourage them, to help them along the way, even when we feel like giving up. Because if someone's not there to help them, they will not become like a Mark, who rises outside of the failures and succeeds at the other end of the spectrum. They won't make it if we don't do our part. God has a plan for each of our individual lives. Notice Mark did not quit and did not give up. Even when he deserted, what was he willing to do? Go back. He was still willing to go back. And when Paul said no, did Mark throw in the towel? No. How humiliating do you think it is to be told no? Ever been denied a promotion at work and then feel bad? Ever been rebuked by your boss and the next day feel like you just want to quit and you don't want to go back to work? Ever had a conflict with your spouse and you wonder, did I make a mistake ever getting married? Did you ever have a conflict with your children in such a way that you say almost to yourself, you don't want to even admit it, was I even supposed to ever have had kids? Was this a mistake? Ever had it that you've had all these moments of doubt and conflict within your mind in such a desperate, annoying, horrible way that you almost feel like a horrible person for ever having the flash of thought in the first place? Don't give up. Be a mark. God has a plan for your life as well. What obstacles are there in your life that is between you and the God who made you, between you and being the child that God wants you to become? What obstacles are there? What do you need to cut out of your life so that you can get there? What do you need to do in your life so that you can mature to be the child you're supposed to become? See, those are the questions we're going to have to ask ourselves on a regular basis. If we're all ever going to be Marks or Pauls or whatever the case is, if we're going to be the type of people that are going to be there for someone and not give up and not even quit on ourselves. I know a lot of us, we're our own worst enemies. We have a lot of negative self-talk that goes on, and we think thoughts about just all the mistakes we made. We think thoughts of all the accusations that should be against us. You know who is considered the accusing one in the scriptures? Satan. He is the accusing one. Those thoughts are not godly thoughts. Those thoughts should be, hey, look, I failed, I screwed up. Praise the Lord that Jesus forgives it. Praise the Lord that he is able to wash it. Praise the Lord that no blood from Christ can fail and that that's covered and that I can get to the other side of this failure. I do not have to continue on the same path. I don't have to give up and say it's all messed up too far beyond what I can handle. I don't have to quit, and you don't have to quit. There is hope for change. There is hope for development, hope for growth. It is there. You can become the child God wants you to be. We just have to go at it like Mark, step by step, knowing that there will be times that we will feel unappreciated, unnoticed, unrecognized, living in obscurity, and be okay with that. And be okay with that. Because we're going to try our best to follow God with every ounce of our being. Is it going to be hard? Yes. Is it going to suck sometimes? Yes. Following God is not an easy path. It's the best path, but it doesn't mean it's always the most pleasurable path at this point. It is hard. It is difficult. We have to make sacrifices. We have to make decisions, deal with regret, and try to make better decisions. And it's going to continue on. We mature only through suffering. And some of us have suffered a lot, and we still have a lot more maturing to do. Will you be the child God wants you to be? Let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father,